That is why the study is also so important, because the problems of journalist safety in Ukraine are becoming visible to important stakeholders. And here it is also important to note that media workers and journalists face risks and threats both as professionals during the performance of their professional tasks and as ordinary citizens in everyday life. They put their lives at risk every day in order to convey the truth about what is happening in Ukraine, about the war crimes committed here, so that the world community knows the truth about this war.
Hello and welcome to Ukraine in Flames, a special project by Ukraine Media Center, an NGO Euro-Atlantic Course, and I'm your host, Myroslava Yaremki. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 became the main challenge for Ukrainian society, including the media environment. Journalists became the targets of attacks, threats, and kidnappings. Due to the temporary occupation of territories and the resulting security risks, many newsrooms were forced to stop their work or relocate away from the hostilities. Outlets that continue to operate in Ukraine suffer from a lack of qualified personnel. In the near future, the industry is threatened by a depletion of human resources. In the long term, gaps may appear in the media environment due to the lack of professionals whose training requires a long time. In today's episode, we're going to talk about security of journalists in Ukraine and challenges for the media community in wartime. If you want to learn more about this subject, please continue watching this video and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss our videos in the future. All these problems were identified by the experts of the Human Rights Platform, who studied the safety conditions of journalists during the full-scale war, particularly in 2022. The work of these experts formed the basis of the analytical report Journalists in Conditions of Full-Scale War, Reporting on Ukraine. For the first time since these indicators were established, the study was conducted in a country in an active phase of war, requiring the research methodology to be adapted to the Ukrainian context. More on the methodology of the research, please welcome researcher of the Media Development Foundation, Oksana.
This study was based on a methodology already developed by UNESCO. It is called Journalist Safety Indicators. According to this methodology, research has already been conducted in other countries, in Kenya, Nepal, Iraq, and Afghanistan. UNESCO has developed a guide according to which researchers in each country can adapt the methodology and conduct a similar assessment on the ground. Of course, you have to consider the context. A full-scale war in its active phase makes adjustments, so we really adapted the methodology. However, the fact that this research has already been conducted in other countries is very important for understanding its importance. It'll be relevant in 2024, in 2025, and in subsequent years because it brings Ukraine into the global context. And we can see a big global picture with journalist safety thanks to the fact that the study is part of a wider program, the UN Action Plan on Journalist Safety and Overcoming Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. That is why the study is also so important, because the problems of journalist safety in Ukraine are becoming visible to important stakeholders. The first block, the first aspect, is statistics about crimes, about impunity for these crimes. To collect these statistics, we use the available data collected by other Ukrainian and international organizations. First of all, these are crimes against journalists, murders of journalists, threats to journalists, threats and direct attacks on particular media organizations and their offices. Everything you need is now in one place. The next four indicators, 4 blocks in our report, are an analysis of the involvement of different groups of stakeholders, everyone who is related to the issue of journalist safety in Ukraine. First of all, these are state institutions, state bodies, politicians, statesmen. We analyzed the legislation. Our lawyers from the Human Rights Platform and experts from other organizations were also involved. We analyzed the legislation, how it changed in 2022. What are the current mechanisms of cooperation between the media and the authorities, including law enforcement agencies? What is the role of the state in the issue of journalist safety? The second group of stakeholders is civil society organizations and scientists, the academic community. We found out what their contribution to the journalist safety is. Spoiler, big. And also how Ukrainian media education was able to adapt to the challenges that appeared during the full-scale war. The third group of stakeholders, perhaps the largest, is the media themselves. We talked to Ukrainian journalists, media managers, in order to understand how media organizations adapted to security challenges, what they were able to do to protect journalists, what they failed to do, and why. All this is detailed in one of the sections of our report. And the last group of stakeholders is, of course, the UN system and other international organizations. We found out what exactly they did for journalist safety. First of all, we wrote about the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, about UNESCO, about the Council of Europe, and also about the OSCE. If you want to know exactly about the role of these organizations, what exactly they did, it is also in our report. You can read it.
In previous years, challenges related to the safety of journalists mostly concerned media workers who conducted journalistic investigations. However, since the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, these challenges are primarily related to the war. Journalists face increased risks both in the performance and non-performance of their professional tasks due to being in a country subject to constant physical and digital attacks. This threat applies to all journalists without exception, not only Ukrainian journalists, but also international journalists who come to Ukraine to cover events. Daria Orlova, PhD in philosophy and associated professor of the Mohyla School of Journalism, will elaborate more on this.
Undoubtedly, 2022 is the year of unprecedented challenges for Ukrainian journalists due to a full-scale invasion. And here it is also important to note that media workers and journalists face risks and threats both as professionals during the performance of their professional tasks and as ordinary citizens in everyday life. That is, Ukrainian journalists cannot distinguish between the risks associated with war coverage and non-working life. As for some standard approaches to ensure the safety of world media journalists who go to cover a particular conflict in any part of the world, it is clear that a journalist goes on a mission. Although there are certain approaches and there is a group of risks, there is also an understanding that a journalist can return, relatively speaking, to a normal life. In the case of Ukrainian journalists, we cannot separate all of these things from each other. This inevitably affects journalists on many levels. This is also about constant physical danger, digital threats and risks, their psychological state that is affected by this constant presence in dangerous conditions. The important fact revealed by our research is that the Ukrainian media have generally demonstrated quite high flexibility in the conditions of dynamic changes. There were many examples of adaptability when the media outlets evacuated their personnel or equipment in advance, when they did it quite successfully, albeit reactively. There were cases when the media outlets left their journalists in the territories that became occupied, and then they also looked for ways to help those journalists, to help them get out, or at least to maximize their safety wherever possible in those conditions. Of course, we don't have such an absolutely complete picture here, because we should understand that this is a sensitive issue. the issue of the safety of those journalists who have remained in the occupied territories. However, despite this rather high adaptability, the acuteness of the situation in 2022 prevented the formalization of security policies. That is, in other words, when we interviewed journalists and asked them whether they had any policies, approaches, safety protocols, how they acted, in most cases they answered that such protocols were mostly verbal, and usually they were guided by their common sense or experience and knowledge accumulated from communication with their colleagues. As for written policies, a very small number of the media outlets had them as of 2022. And of course, the problem of inequality between Ukrainian and foreign media became even more acute. Because we interviewed in particular journalists representing foreign media. And there, of course, the situation was often completely different. In some cases, it was even about things that might seem like a luxury to Ukrainian journalists. Traveling in 2 cars, if it is a business trip, moving around accompanied by security specialists who have traveled to the hotspots of the world and have extensive experience. And of course, this looks like a different reality for many Ukrainian journalists. It is interesting that some Ukrainian journalists combine their experience as, say, fixers, assistants, or producers in cooperation with international media, and then they saw those practices. And then they had their own personal business trips without such resources as their foreign colleagues had. And so they used their, let's say, ingenuity, accumulated experience and approaches on how to be when there are no resources available.
Representative of the International Solidarity Fund in Ukraine, Anastasia Chornohorska, says that it's very difficult for Ukrainian journalists to work in these realities because it is impossible to guarantee safety. Therefore, it is very important to support such a study, the report of which will contribute to conveying this information to the world community. Let's take a listen.
In general, it is very difficult to talk about safety in a country in which a war has been going on for the 3rd year, in which the territories are occupied by the aggressor. The aggressor country that wants to destroy not only the Ukrainian people, Ukrainian society, but also the democratic values shared by the Ukrainian society, and our struggle for these values are supported by the world community. It is very difficult for Ukrainian journalists to work in these realities, because their safety cannot be guaranteed. They put their lives at risk every day in order to convey the truth about what is happening in Ukraine, about the war crimes committed here, so that the world community knows the truth about this war. Therefore, it was very important for us to support this research, the result of which is the report presented today, which contributes to conveying this information to the world community. In general, solidarity with Ukraine, with Ukrainian society, is very important to me as a representative of an international organization, and in particular of a Polish organization. It is important to stress that Ukrainian journalists' voices are heard in Poland. Poland stands in solidarity with Ukraine. And as a sign of such support, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland, through our International Solidarity Fund, has joined the UNESCO initiative and financed the conduct of this research. It is very important to emphasize that the research was conducted according to the UNESCO methodology. It allows us to speak on world platforms about what is happening in Ukraine, to convey this truth, and thanks to this, to encourage the international community to participate in supporting, ensuring, and increasing the level of security of Ukrainian journalists, wherever possible in such conditions. And we, as an organization, will also promote the dissemination of this report on international platforms.
You've been watching a special project by Ukraine Media Center and Euro-Atlantic course dedicated to the Russian-Ukrainian war, Ukraine in Flames. In description under this video, you can find information on how you can help Ukraine fight Russian aggression. If you find our work useful, please like and share this video. Slava Ukraini!